He stood alone near the edge of the SEAL training compound, a solitary figure, just an old man in a worn flannel shirt, boots that had seen too many miles, and a cap so faded that the stitching had long since disappeared. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply watched as recruits crawled through the mud, scaled walls that seemed impossible to climb, and shouted under pressure. The intensity of the drills seemed to roll off him like water on a duck's back. To the recruits and instructors, he was a non-entity, a quiet presence, just an old man who wandered too close to the action, perhaps a local with no particular business being there. He didn't stand out. At least, not at first. Most people barely gave him a second thought. Before we go any further, let me ask you something from the heart. Are you ready to help us honor the unsung heroes who have sacrificed so much in silence? If you believe stories like these, raw and powerful, deserve to be shared, please leave a comment and hit that subscribe button to help keep them alive. What's happening here is more than just a story, it's a reminder of the silent legends among us, waiting to be noticed. But then something happened. One recruit, his name was Myers, he slowed down during a particularly grueling drill, his eyes catching something that wasn't supposed to be there, not on a man like that. The old man had his sleeves rolled up, and for the briefest of moments, the recruit noticed something on his forearm. A tattoo. It wasn't decorative, not something done out of whimsy or youthful rebellion. No, this was a trident, a sharp, precise design, something that wasn't chosen on a whim. It was the kind of mark you don't buy, it's the kind of mark you earn. And in that single moment, Myers froze. He had no idea who this old man was, but he suddenly realized that the man wasn't just some harmless bystander, some guy who'd wandered too close to the compound. No, this was a man who had been there long before any of them had even put on boots. This man had walked that line, faced that struggle, bled for that same insignia. He came every Thursday, without fail. Always alone. Always early. Before the instructors arrived, before the familiar sound of drills and cadences echoed across the compound, before the first recruit even put a boot on the ground. He would park his old, rusted Ford pickup truck just past the perimeter fence and step out of it with a limp. The truck was a relic, just like the man driving it, looking older than half the recruits training here. His walk was slow, deliberate, almost as if he had time on his hands, or maybe he was conserving energy for something more important. But whatever the reason, his movements were measured, purposeful. He always made his way to the far edge of the field, near the boundary but never crossing it. He didn't interfere, didn't approach the recruits. He just stood there, arms crossed, watching. His left boot, slightly turned inward, betrayed the years of wear and tear. Something about him made the younger recruits ignore him, as they had enough to worry about with their drills. But the older ones would joke, he's here for nostalgia. Maybe for guilt. They didn't know. And honestly, they didn't care to know. But the instructors? They knew. They might not have known exactly who he was, but they knew what he represented. None of them dared to ask him to leave. None of them told him to go. There was no need. Respect wasn't given here, it was earned. And whatever this man had done, he had earned his place to stand there, without explanation. He didn't wear any medals. No rank insignia. No fancy patches. Just that same faded cap and flannel shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal the faintest hint of ink. It wasn't obvious at first, just the faintest shadow of a symbol, hidden under the skin and the wear of age. And every now and then, the breeze would lift the cuff of his sleeve just enough for someone to catch a glimpse of it, a trident. Not stylized, not exaggerated, just the sharp, clean edges of the SEAL trident. The kind of tattoo that wasn't for show. The kind that wasn't meant to be seen by anyone who wasn't worthy of understanding what it meant. One day, it happened. The heat hung thick over the compound, a stifling, oppressive weight. The instructors shouted commands through bullhorns, and the sound of boots hitting dirt echoed like thunder across the field. The recruits, young and determined, pushed themselves, digging deep, their bodies shaking, their minds fogged by the exhaustion. But one recruit, Myers, wasn't just going through the motions. His eyes were trained on the old man again, just like they had been the week before. The old man was standing in his usual spot, arms crossed, no clipboard in his hand, no whistle around his neck, no uniform to indicate who or what he was. He was just there, leaning against a rusted post, watching the chaos unfold with the quiet intensity of someone who had seen it all before. Myers noticed that the old man's eyes didn't wander. They didn't just sweep over the recruits like the gaze of an uninterested bystander. No, his eyes were sharp, focused. They tracked certain recruits, following their movements with the precision of someone who had been through this, who had faced it all. The way his head tilted slightly, measuring, assessing, calculating. Every step, every misstep, every rifle dropped during the low crawl, he saw it all. But his body didn't shift. His posture didn't change. He was still, as if he had been standing under pressure his entire life. And then, like a whisper in the wind, it happened. A gust of dry air swept through the compound, lifting dust and shirt sleeves. For a brief moment, the old man's sleeve lifted just high enough for Myers to see it. The tattoo. The trident. Old and faded, blending into the leathery skin of the man's forearm. It wasn't just ink. It was history. A history that none of them could even begin to understand unless they'd earned it themselves. Myers froze. His body recognized what his brain hadn't yet caught up to. That man wasn't a random bystander. He wasn't just a ghost of some forgotten time. No. He was someone who had walked that path long before any of them had even considered it. The weight of that realization hit him like a hammer. He didn't move at first. He just stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing. Later, after the day's drills had ended and the instructors had dispersed, Myers found himself walking along the gravel path behind the main training center, his feet carrying him without any clear destination. The old pickup was still there, parked just beyond the fence. The man was there too, sipping from a dented thermos, staring across the now empty field. There was no reason for him to be here, not really. He wasn't part of the program, not in the traditional sense. But his presence carried weight. Myers didn't speak. He didn't approach. He simply stood there at a respectful distance, unsure why his legs had brought him here. The old man didn't acknowledge him. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. The way he existed in that space, it demanded respect, but never asked for it. Eventually, the man stood up. It wasn't with effort. There was no groan, no strain. He simply moved, as if conserving his energy for something else. He glanced at Myers once, not with recognition, not with a smile, just a brief, appraising look. And then he stepped into his truck, closing the door softly behind him, and drove away down the dusty path, the tires crunching on the gravel in a rhythm that seemed slower than the drills but somehow more profound. Myers stood there long after the truck was gone, the last rays of the setting sun catching the flagpole behind him. He didn't know what the old man came for every week. He didn't know where he had been or what he had done. But he did know one thing without a doubt, this man had earned the silence that others took for granted. That night, as Myers lay in his bunk, his muscles aching from the day's exertion, he found it impossible to sleep. His body was exhausted. His mind throbbed from dehydration. But that wasn't what kept him awake. No, it was the image of the old man, the tattoo, the glance, the silence. He had seen men try to bluff their way through stolen valor, flashing fake patches and scripted stories. But this man was different. There was no bravado, no attempt to claim what wasn't his. The most unsettling thing about him was how little he said. He didn't need to say anything. His presence alone demanded respect. At 2 a.m., unable to rest, Myers quietly rolled out of his bunk, careful not to disturb the others. He walked to the rec room, where he could access a few minutes of Wi-Fi in peace. His eyes were heavy with fatigue, but his mind wouldn't let go of the mystery. He opened his laptop, his fingers still dusty from the day's drills, and began searching. What did he search for? Old SEAL veterans, tattoos, training compounds. He wasn't sure, but he kept digging. And that's when he found it. A field entry from 2 years ago. T. Harrow. Retired. Authorized visitor. No instructional role. Just there, granted permission to observe without explanation. Myers was taken aback. This wasn't normal. No civilian got that kind of access without a damn good reason. The entry had been renewed every year. No expiration date. No formal title. He dug deeper, finding more references to the name Harrow. One mention in a 2003 debrief note, outlining a revision of SEAL readiness protocols, described Harrow as a foundational operator involved in early deep recon doctrine. But there was no service number. No deployments. Just the name. And further down, another mention, a vague reference in an old oral history project. The metadata listed Harrow T as the field lead in a mission with SEAL Team 2, back in 1970, deep in Laos. There were no records filed, no debriefs. The outcome? Classified. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, but the picture wasn't clear yet. One thing was certain though, this was no ordinary man. And the respect he had earned wasn't just from the training compound. It was something much, much deeper. Myers leaned back in his chair, his mind racing with everything he had just uncovered. Laos, back then, that wasn't even supposed to exist. The operations carried out there weren't written down, they weren't acknowledged, and yet, they happened. The men who survived those operations, if they came back at all, became ghosts, buried behind redactions, swallowed by silence. Myers closed his laptop slowly, a weight settling deep in his chest. There was no triumph here, no breakthrough, only a quiet, heavy realization. Whoever this man was, whoever Thomas Harrow really was, he hadn't come here to be remembered. He hadn't come for recognition or praise. No, he had come to watch. Watch and see if the next generation of warriors was ready to carry the weight of what they had done. And suddenly, Myers wasn't sure if they were. That Thursday, as if to prove that nothing ever really changes, the old man returned, same truck, same thermos, same quiet stance along the fence. There was nothing different about his demeanor, but something in the air felt heavy. It was as if the whole compound was holding its breath, waiting for something, though no one could put their finger on it. And when training started, it wasn't the drills or the instructors that captured Myers' attention, it was the old man. The instructors were sharper, the cadences somehow quieter. The atmosphere felt taut, like everything was happening under the weight of his presence. The old man stood still as ever, arms crossed, cap casting a shadow over his eyes. He didn't move, didn't speak, and yet, this time, he wasn't invisible. He was a force. A silent one. But a force, nonetheless. It started with a shift, a single glance. One instructor, a senior petty officer with a silver star tucked deep into his record, slowed his pace during a march rotation. His eyes flicked toward the old man, and in that instant, his face tightened. He froze, not out of confusion or surprise, but because he recognized something. Something that, once seen, could never be unseen. And just as quickly as the glance had occurred, he moved on, quieter than before. Myers watched it all, his heart pounding with the realization that something far deeper was going on here. Later, during rope ascent drills, 2 more instructors stopped near the observation line, their eyes lingering on the man who had never asked for attention. They didn't speak. They didn't nod. They just stood there, their gazes locked on the old man. And it wasn't about who was watching. It wasn't about the recruits scrambling up the ropes, struggling with their own weight. No. This was something unspoken, something that stretched back further than the walls of the compound. It was the silent acknowledgement of the men who had come before them. It was a tribute to the warriors whose sacrifices had never made it into the history books, whose stories had never been told. By late afternoon, the compound had quieted. The recruits, drained from hours of grueling exercises, were dragging themselves back to the barracks, their bodies aching, their spirits low. But Myers couldn't leave. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the old man, who still stood across the field, watching, as if everything had led up to this moment. There was no camera, no clipboard. Just presence. The quiet kind that fills a room without a word spoken. And then, it happened. One of the instructors, a man who never broke his posture, who never deviated from the schedule, suddenly walked toward the fence. No command was given, no words were spoken. He didn't wave, didn't smile, didn't even acknowledge the man. He simply walked up, stopped 10 feet away, and stood at attention, perfect, textbook posture. A moment passed, and then another instructor joined him, then a third, then more. One by one, they lined up across the compound, facing the man who had never asked to be seen. The silence grew deeper, stretching across the entire field. There were no orders. No speeches. No explanation. It just happened. It was as if something buried deep inside them had been uncovered, and the only response was to stand. To honor. To respect. Myers stood frozen, his chest tightening as he watched the scene unfold before him. It wasn't awe that gripped him. It wasn't confusion. No, it was something deeper, understanding. In that moment, nothing else mattered, not the scores, not the ranks, not the qualifications. What mattered was the weight of the man standing there, the silent figure who had never sought attention, who had never demanded anything. His silence alone carried more meaning than any ribbon or medal could ever convey. That tattoo, that unspoken history pressed into his skin, Myers understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, what it truly meant to earn respect. And then, the old man finally turned. He made his way toward his truck, slow and deliberate. No one moved. The stillness hung in the air like a veil. As he opened the truck door, the silence was finally broken. One voice, calm and grounded, cut through the air. It was the Master Chief. His words, simple and sincere, held a weight all their own. "Sir," he said, not with command, but with respect. "Would you consider speaking to the recruits next week?" The old man paused. His hand was already on the door, but he looked back, just slightly. His voice, low and final, echoed across the field. Nothing to say. And with that, he climbed into his truck, closed the door, and drove off, the gravel crunching under the tires as the dust slowly settled behind him. No fanfare. No thanks. No applause. Just the sound of the truck fading into the distance. But long after he was gone, the instructors stood there. They didn't move. They didn't need to be told to stay. Some things don't need an explanation. Some men don't need to explain who they are. You just see it in the way others rise when they appear. In the days that followed, the compound seemed to return to normal. The drills picked up again, the shouting resumed, and the recruits went back to counting reps, miles, and bruises. But something had shifted. Something beneath the surface had changed. Those who had witnessed what had happened that Thursday didn't forget. They didn't speak of it, but they carried it with them, quietly, like an unspoken truth. And Myers felt it more than anyone. The old man's silence lingered with him in the locker room, in the obstacle lanes, and in the way he now triple-checked his posture and studied the instructors with newfound attention. It wasn't just reverence he felt. It was responsibility. That tattoo, that silent stare, the weight of history pressed into the skin and silence, it had changed something inside of him. He couldn't shake it. He couldn't walk away from it. He had to acknowledge it, somehow. One night, after lights out, he spoke in a whisper to two teammates who had stood near the fence that day. "We should mark that spot," he said. "Lane 4, the fence line." The response was immediate and quiet. "How?" one of them asked. No laughter. No questions. Just understanding. They didn't announce it. They didn't ask for permission. They simply acted. A few nights later, under the cover of darkness, they returned to the observation post with a small brass plate, polished by hand. They bolted it carefully to the inside of the fence, just above eye level. It wasn't flashy. There were no medals. No names. No dates. Just a few engraved words, reserved until he says otherwise. And no one noticed. No one outside the unit paid it any mind. It wasn't a memorial. It was a placeholder, a mark of presence, a nod to memory, a quiet tribute to everything the old man had carried without ever asking to be seen. The following Thursday, he returned. Right on time. Same boots. Same jacket. Same thermos in hand. He walked past the trucks, past the field, and paused just briefly, his eyes falling on the new plaque. He didn't touch it. He didn't react. He simply looked at it, and then turned back toward the course, leaning against the same post as always. But something had changed. This time, when the recruits passed the fence line, they straightened their backs. They didn't know who he was. They didn't need to. But they felt what he represented, and that was enough. It wasn't until weeks later that anyone learned his name. He never offered it. He never wore it. But word has a way of drifting when the silence is respected. One of the instructors, an older team leader, recognized the tattoo. Not from history books, not from a picture, but from a face in a grainy photograph sealed inside a file few ever read. The name was Thomas Harrow, S1, SEAL Team 2. His operations were legendary in whispered conversations. There were no public commendations. No medals. No official records. Just the men who had been there, who had seen it firsthand, and who would never speak of it. Harrow kept coming every Thursday. Never missed. Never asked for anything. And every time he stood at the fence, more and more recruits noticed. They didn't talk. They didn't stare. They didn't try to figure him out. They just watched. And they straightened their lines. Tightened their stances. Not because someone told them to, but because presence teaches louder than any command. One morning, Harrow didn't come. No announcement. No explanation. Just an empty spot along the fence. They waited. One Thursday. 2. A month. The plaque remained. And the silence remained. Eventually, Myers, now in the final phase of his training, found himself back at Lane 4, standing alone. The compound was still. The air was thick with that rare tension that hangs between nightfall and memory. He stood where Harrow had once stood, arms folded, eyes fixed on the course. It wasn't the same, but it was something, a quiet ritual of respect, a way to say thank you without ever saying a word. And when he turned to leave, he noticed something taped gently to the back of the plaque. A folded envelope, weathered by time. His name was written on it, just Myers, no rank, no title. Inside was a coin, old and heavy, scratched by time. One side bore the trident. The other side had no words, just a single hand-lettered line, still watching. He never found out who left it. No one claimed to know. But Myers didn't need confirmation. Some men never disappear. They just fade quietly into the lives they've shaped, leaving behind nothing but discipline, silence, and an example that speaks long after they're gone. Thomas Harrow never wanted to be remembered. He never told his story. But the silence he left behind taught a generation how to listen. What struck me most about this story is the profound silence of the old man and what it teaches us about respect, history, and the weight of personal experience. In a world that constantly craves recognition, attention, and validation, it's powerful to think that some of the greatest warriors, whether on the battlefield or in life, leave behind no fanfare, no boastful claims. Their strength lies not in what they say, but in the silence they carry. Too often, society is consumed by noise, the loudest voices, the biggest accolades, the flashiest successes. We forget that the real markers of greatness are often quiet, unseen, and understated. This story reminds me that we need to rethink how we measure a person's worth. It's not in the medals they wear or the titles they claim. Sometimes, it's the way they show up in the world without demanding anything in return, just standing firm, doing what needs to be done, and trusting that true respect will be earned, not announced. Maybe it's time we all learn to listen more, observe more, and appreciate the silent strength that exists in the shadows. That's where the true lessons lie. Now, let me ask you, have you ever met someone like that? Someone who carried more than they ever said and left something behind without asking for attention? If so, tell us about them in the comments. Let their story be heard. And if this story resonates with you, please, subscribe and support us. We are growing every day, and your support helps us keep these voices alive. Thank you for watching.